Evening all. William Rufus, who reigned from 1087 through to 1100, has always got a really negative write-up from the sources that were written then and near to the time, certainly when compared to his father, William the Conqueror. For example, Henry of Huntingdon literally calls him an evil king. William of Malmesbury, who was writing in the 1130s, depicted William Rufus as a licentious king who was addicted to vice, who was conned out of money by his own servants, and who kept troops of prostitutes of both genders at court. And those are just two of the nicer descriptions. I mean, he gets an equally bad, if not worse, write-up from sources such as Orderic Vitalis or Eadmer of Canterbury, and in particular the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. Now, what you have to bear in mind with all of those primary sources is that either they're all monastic writers or they're written by people who were connected to the church in some way, Henry of Huntingdon being the son of a priest. And of course they would say that, wouldn't they? They would condemn William Rufus because, as anyone who studied the reign knows, Rufus had a reputation for using the church for money, would deliberately leave bishops' positions unfilled, and even the Archbishop of Canterbury position was unfilled for 4 years, from 1089 through to 1093, when he eventually appointed Archbishop Anselm, in order to rake in the revenue from the bishops' and archbishops' estates. And he did see the church as a source of income, and so it's inevitable, therefore, that given that the sources are monastic writers, they'll depict him in a very negative way. And given that it is also the case that he probably did have a court which at the time would have been seen as licentious, and using a modern definition, he probably was gay, although the concept of gay did not exist in the Middle Ages, and he wouldn't have defined himself as such. The only language there to define sexuality, same-sex sexuality, would have been, to view it as just one of a number of vices. That's how the medieval mind worked. But he probably was gay, and that just adds to the reason why he has such a negative reputation from these monastic writers. However, it's possible to argue that William Rufus, far from being a bad king, was actually a highly successful medieval monarch. And the starting point has to be to define what a successful medieval monarch actually is. Well, basically, the job of a medieval monarch included, first of all, the ability to defend the realm and to defend the land, and hopefully to extend it, but certainly to defend what he'd inherited from William the Conqueror, which was an Anglo-Norman kingdom, Normandy and England. So he has to defend that. Also, he has to be successful in war, another key attribute of a medieval king. And that includes being able to put down internal rebellions, be they from the English or be they from Norman barons. He will need to put those down. And that leads into another aspect of a successful medieval king, the ability to successfully manage the magnates and the nobles and the barons. You basically have to keep most of your nobles on your side. Kings who alienate factions of the nobility, if those factions are large enough, run the risk of trouble. And you can think, you can see later on in the Middle Ages that happening to people like Edward II and later Henry VI. So you have to keep the support of the majority of your nobility, and you have to be able to successfully manage the nobility. Now, and that includes balancing different factions within the nobility and not appearing to favour one faction particularly. Now, I think it's possible to see that in most of those areas, if not all of them, Rufus had a large degree of success. I mean, first, if we take defence, he was able to successfully defend his father's conquest of England, and he consolidated control of it. Because obviously, a big test of the Norman conquest would be would Norman control of England be able to survive once the conqueror was dead, once this huge personality was removed from the scene? Well, Rufus proved that it could. And not only did he successfully keep hold of England, but he was also eventually able to wrestle control of Normandy off his older brother Robert Curthose, who had become Duke of Normandy, nominally in 1076, and then certainly after William the Conqueror died in 1087. Well, in 1091, Rufus successfully invaded Normandy and wrestled control of most of the north of Normandy out of Robert. They did a deal where Rufus would run the north and Robert would run the south. And then later, when Robert Curthose went on the First Crusade, Rufus was more than able to help Robert along his way by offering him money to go on crusade, and in return Rufus would look after Normandy in his absence, and was probably expecting Robert never to return. So by the end of it, Rufus controls both England and Normandy. So he's not only defended his legacy of England, but he's also recreated his father's Anglo-Norman kingdom. In terms of putting down rebellions, well, William Rufus only faced two major rebellions in his reign. One was in 1088 when he first came to the throne, or just the year afterwards, and the other one was in 1095. Both of these rebellions were carried out by disaffected Norman barons. The first one was probably the most serious because it was an attempt by a group of barons to recreate the Anglo-Norman kingdom by putting Robert in control of England and replacing William Rufus with Robert. And it involved his two uncles, Robert of Mortain and Bishop Odo of Bayeux. Well, that one was certainly crushed, and one of the ways in which Rufus crushed it, apart from swift and decisive action, was the quite clever and ruthless tactic of promising the English all manner of concessions, including lower taxes and less harsh forest laws, in order that they support him against the Norman barons he was trying to crush. And it succeeded. They did lend their support. He crushed that rebellion in 1088, and he crushed another one by another group of disaffected barons over land in 1095. And in both cases, the English played a role in crushing the barons. Of course, Rufus didn't follow the promise through of granting those concessions to the English. So he's more than happy to, tell a few porkies maybe to get them on side in the first place. But that arguably just shows that he was a good and effective manager. So he crushes rebellions, he defends the realm. In terms of managing the nobility, there is some evidence that William Rufus was unpopular with some of the barons. There was that second rebellion in 1095. And it's also the case that in 1095 at the Council of Rockingham, where Rufus was trying to get more power at over the English Church, the barons opposed Rufus and prevented him from doing this. Well, the barons in the council did. However, it is the case that William Rufus maintained the support of the majority of the barons, or enough of the barons, throughout his reign, because there was no serious opposition to him. Both rebellions were pretty easily crushed, and overall, he was not usurped, unless you believe that his eventual death in the New Forest was more than an accident. But he wasn't usurped, and he was able to keep the support of enough people for most of the time, which is the basic job. Now, one of the big things that's said as a criticism of William Rufus, and it is a fair limitation to its success, I suppose, is that he was extremely unpopular with the church. And a medieval king was an anointed Christian king and was supposed to have at least appear to be a Christian king. And in some ways, William Rufus fell short of that. He is said to have openly mocked the church in certain ways. He is also said to have run an extremely licentious court. There is evidence that he indulged in certain vices and so forth. However, what must never be forgotten is that William Rufus was popular with huge sections of the English clergy. At the Council of Rockingham in 1095, the bishops actually supported William Rufus. Now, admittedly, he'd recently appointed 8 new bishops, and they were probably highly grateful for that and willing to support the king, but that's not the point. The point is the bishops did support him at the council. And it shouldn't be forgotten also that despite quarrels with the Pope, despite for years not recognising Urban II as the rightful Pope, relations between William Rufus and the Pope never completely broke down in an ultra serious way. I mean, it wasn't like the reign of King John, where England was placed under an interdict and the churches closed for huge amounts of time. And despite the fact that William Rufus quarrelled with his Archbishop of Canterbury, Anselm, continually, and the two men probably hated each other, there was no kind of incident like in the reign of Henry II with the murder of Thomas Becket or anything of that nature. And yet if you read some of these primary sources, you will think that William Rufus was the most hated and unpopular king with the church that you can imagine. Clearly that is not necessarily the case. It's not necessarily the full picture. The bottom line is that William Rufus's reputation for centuries was basically framed by these monastic sources. They were either written at the time or written mostly a few years afterwards, near enough to the time, but in the 1120s, 1130s. It's people like Orderic Vitalis, William of Malmesbury, Henry of Huntingdon, Eadmer of Canterbury, the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. And what do they all have in common? They're either all monastic writers or they're people connected with the church. And, they did resent the fact that William Rufus was extracting huge amounts of revenue from the church, and they probably resented his lifestyle and his fun and games and so forth at the court. At the end of the day, despite what these people say, despite the kind of anecdotes in William of Malmesbury's source about him easily being conned out of money by his servants, at the end of the day, in terms of the real things that matter, as regards the success of an English king, do they successfully defend the kingdom? Do they successfully crush rebellions? Do they successfully manage the nobility so they avoid being usurped? In all of those cases, William Rufus is a highly competent king. He is successful in war, when he goes over to Normandy and wrestles northern Normandy out of Robert, and in the essential matters he's a successful king. Of course, it's possible to argue that like his father William the Conqueror, he brutally oppressed the English. I mean, he did make the forest laws so brutal they were almost barbaric. They punished poaching with mutilation, and if you just walk through the forest and scare one of the deer, you could lose a hand or both hands, or foot or both feet, or you could be blinded for some of these offences, walking through the forest, shooting at deer and so on. So the forest laws were controversial and were hated. However, none of that is anything on the scale of the harrying of the north carried out by his father William the Conqueror, where 100,000 people probably died. And yet William the Conqueror doesn't get the negative press from the primary sources that William Rufus does. Therefore, what I'm saying is, at the end of the day, in most of the key criteria, William Rufus was a successful medieval king. Thanks for listening.